The Russians say they won't invade Ukraine, and the Ukraine president tends to agree. But it is still the prevailing narrative, at least in Britain and America.
Our first guest is an American and a conservative, the host of RT's legendary Crosstalk. He's Peter Lavelle, and he joins us now. Resplendent is the battle of the bow ties in this episode of Sputnik. But tell me this, Peter. It seems to have all gone quiet, at least from the Russian and Ukrainian government perspectives. But it's certainly not quiet here. There's a cacophony in the British media this morning about imminent invasion.
Well, yeah, this is all basically coming from Washington in London. We had President Zelensky basically show us what's behind the curtain, because it's what the Washington and what London are reporting is part of their propaganda ploy. And it has nothing to do with Ukraine. They don't care about Ukraine one way or another. And Zelensky's realized that he's put himself even personally into the crosshairs. And so he sees that his country is, as a result of NATO expansion, is just going to be cannon fodder for an agenda that is settled somewhere else. So, and Biden, with his usual gaffes, he let loose also, is that, that there's the reality of what's being played out on the ground and the propaganda program that's being deployed on a massive scale are so divorced from each other. And if you point that out, then you incur the wrath of the powers that be. Zelensky is in a very precarious position right now because he actually said the truth.
Well, he might get regime changed by Washington rather than Moscow.
Yes, he will, yes.
That wouldn't be the first time that had happened. But to be fair, Russia has parked at least 100,000 soldiers close to the Ukrainian border. Was that all a bluff by Putin?
Look, first of all, this is up to 175 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. Number two, even Ukrainian military officials, high military officials, say, and because I'm not a military man, you're not a military man, is that these are not in battle formation. I mean, Russia has troops in its own country. The area that they're making reference to is where they have always had exercises. So it would be like, Russia saying to the UK, what are you doing with this air squadron in Scotland? We want answers. I mean, this is absurd, okay? And number two, Russia has no interest in invading Ukraine. It has no interest in regime changing Ukraine. They saw what the West did with regime change and the disaster it created. This is a storm that's being created out of nothing. Now, having said that, George, if NATO were to accept Ukraine as a full member, if NATO uses offensive weapons, moves offensive weapons right up to the Russian-Ukraine border, then we're talking a totally different thing. And the Russians have made this clear for a very long time. The story is this, George. On December 17th, Russia sent two documents, one to NATO, one to the United States. About NATO expansion, it must stop. Number two, offensive weapons cannot be put on its border. That's it. Now, why doesn't Blinken and the rest of them respond to that? They won't. They talk about completely different things. And this is what's so frustrating.
So, Peter, all this rampant war-like talk, all these threats coming from Washington and London are very reminiscent of the Iraq War. But Russia, of course, is not Iraq.
That really gets to the kernel of it all here. And also, I like the parallel, except for this is on steroids. It's more difficult, more assets and time and effort being put into this campaign, propaganda campaign, but you're having a lot more dissent. The Germans particularly are pointing out that, what you're doing for Europe's defense is actually going to crush our economy. And the Germans are painfully aware of this. And that's why you see in the British press and the American press, a lot of these really negative stories about Germany not holding up its side of the deal. And like Nord Stream 2, they keep talking about this. I've never seen one Western media outlet actually know the whole story or the real story of Nord Stream 2. It was the Germans that asked the Russians to build it. They said, we need more natural gas from you. We need, and always in the back of the mind is, they won't say it publicly because it's politically correct, but Ukraine's just not a reliable partner for transit. So we just want the pipeline just to come straight to us. So this is, the Germans wanted it, the Russians built it. Now the Russians are saying, now you don't want it? I mean, and it's always talking about who can trust whom here. Well, why would the Russians trust anybody in the West anymore? I mean, we even built a pipeline for you, and now you don't want to use it? I mean, and then the crazies in Washington say maybe we should destroy it. I mean, this is a level of fanaticism I've never seen, and it's extremely dangerous. And again, I keep stressing to people, this is not about Ukraine. It is about NATO expansion and the idea of security being indivisible. What does that mean? During the Helsinki Final Act in the 1970s, codifying the post-war arrangement in Europe, it was agreed no country can attain more security at the expense of another. That was part of the DNA of NATO. And now, with the end of the Cold War, they've thrown that all aside. Russia's saying, fine, but you have to respect our security interests. And if you don't do it, we're the only ones that will.
Neither France nor Germany, of course, joined the Iraq war, and they don't seem to fancy any war with Russia either. Surrender monkeys, I think George Bush's acolytes called them at the time. But I've got to go back to this. If Russia can put its forces in whatever number anywhere in Russia, however close to somebody else's border, why can't a country like Poland or Hungary or Bulgaria, which is a NATO member, put as many NATO forces as close to anybody's border as they like?
In 1997, when we had the foundation agreement between Russia and NATO, they said that they would not do that. They would only do it on a temporary basis. So it's not that they can't do it. It's part of these how to describe it, transparency issues. Say, look, Moscow, we're going to be sending some troops here for a rotation. You don't have to worry about anything. It's only trading and things like that. That's not the case right now, okay? Again, NATO keeps saying it has its own rules, but it's breaking its own rules all of the time. And so what party is the one that is distrusted the most? It's the party that breaks its own rules and makes outrageous accusations, okay? And also the issue is that, Ukraine is not in NATO. Okay, that's one thing. What the countries do within NATO, the Russians sometimes object, saying, why are you bringing these systems so close to our borders? But for 30 years, they've had to live with it. Now they're just saying, look, there's so much lack of transparency. Your rhetoric is reckless and dangerous, and this is one of the reasons why it's come to a head here. George, the point is that NATO has, for 30 years, been able to brush off Russia's security concerns and just say, you're paranoid. Well, no, we're here. We've come to the Rubicon. And it's the proactive measures by NATO that is prompting this. This is not just Russia saying out of a whim, we're going to threaten Ukraine. They don't care very much about Ukraine. If the Ukrainian government attacks the Donbass, the Russians will react, and they will react with great ferocity. Okay, and this is the quote-unquote false flag that so many people are worried about. The Ukrainians do something against the Donbass, the Russians react and say, see, the Russians started it. That's what they're worried about most.
We watched The Last Tsars on Netflix the other day, a very, very good series indeed. But what was striking was that long before the existence of the Soviet Union, there was a Russian empire. I mean, the king was in Moscow, but he could quite as easily have been in his palace in Kiev. Ukraine was a part of the Russian Empire then. People here in the West say that Vladimir Putin is trying to rebuild a Romanov-type Russian empire. Is that true?
Absolutely not true. Absolutely. Look, Kyrgyzstan, one of the former republics, Soviet republic, they have many people there say they want to rejoin Russia. And the Russians say, no, we don't want you, okay? We're done with the imperial stuff. We did it with the Russian Empire. We did it with the Soviet Union. We're much better taking care of our own vast country. There is no stomach for it whatsoever. You know, Russia is eyeing the Baltic republics. For what? Why? Okay. Also, you had the people in the Donbass that made the choice of having a referendum to leave Ukraine and join Russia, and the Russians said, "Don't do that. We're not agreeing to that." Okay. There's no stomach for it. The Russians have no territorial ambitions whatsoever. Having said that, remember in February 2014, the overthrow of legitimate elected government of Ukraine. Ukraine went into a failed state mode, and the Russians could not take any risk and say, "Hey, people in Crimea, you voted before to leave Ukraine. Are you up to it now?" They said, "Yes, have your vote." We took them in. Okay. The term annexation is completely inappropriate. Annexation is gaining land through conflict, through aggression. There was a referendum. How aggressive is a referendum?
Is it the talk of every tea room in Russia, what's happening in Ukraine? Is it a big subject at all?
I would say it's the number three, the economy, COVID, and then foreign policy. Nobody's talking about war here. No one. It's just not top of mind. If you go to Ukraine, the same thing applies. Economy and COVID.
So we can rest a little easier having heard from the host of Crosstalk. There ain't going to be war between Russia and Ukraine. Peter, you've relieved me mightily. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on board the Sputnik.
Always my pleasure.
Thank you.